We are just days away from when California's reparations task force will submit a final report to lawmakers. Black Californians could qualify if they can prove they're descendants of free or enslaved black people during the 19th century. But how would you do that?
New tonight, CBS 13 Shawnte Passmore is getting answers on the best way to prove your lineage.
Finding your roots.
My mother was raised here.
Kathy Lynne Marshall successfully navigated the complex journey.
It's not impossible for African Americans where it gets dicey. The 1870 census was the first time that we are shown by name in a census.
Recently, dozens gathered to see if they could trace their family history.
If you don't know where you're coming from, you have no sense of direction.
The question, who are your ancestors, will be pivotal if California's reparations task force gets its way. First, a final report of recommendations is due to the legislature before July 1st. Next, lawmakers will need to craft legislation followed by the governor's approval. But how or who will determine who's qualified?
There is no definitive way of how that can be proven.
It is just as complex.
The task force may have thought it was an easy thing to do. It is not.
While the details have yet to iron out, Marshall says now is the time for Black Californians to prove they're descendants of an enslaved or free Black person in the 19th century. Records like birth and marriage certificates are a start. Anything before the 1870 U.S. Census, the Freedmen's Bureau chronicles life following the end of slavery. For example, work contracts may show an employer's name, who may have also been the former slave owner. This lead could show who belonged to that person.
I think when people start uncovering different narratives within their family tree, some of that's going to be really hard. How was that for you? It's a really good point, especially when DNA testing is involved. You may find secrets, things that you did not know about your family.
Marshall hopes Black Californians will soon uncover who they are.
Don't wait for what reparations may or may not be. Write your stories now.
The Greater Sacramento African American Genealogy Society tells us another great source, the Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage. We'll have those resources at cbs13.com.
I'd like to share 3 broad tips to help you find your African American ancestors. The first main tip is to build a family tree with documents that prove your lineage. So imagine that you are the trunk of your family tree. First, interview any elders you might have to learn about other family members, relatives, stories they might have, documents they may have, videotape them. Try to get as much information as you can, the oral history from your family. Then add 1 tree branch for your mother and 1 for your father. So put your mother's name and your father's name on the other side of your tree. You're going to prove their parentage with birth, marriage, death certificates, obituaries, church records, anything that you can think of that will prove that they are your parents. And then you're going to continue adding branches for additional generations with the above documents and census records. Now, census records, hopefully you'll be able to find all the way back to 1870 with many generations in your family. 1870 was the first year that most African Americans were included on the American census, but there are some states like Alabama that actually have censuses in 1866. But this is just a way to get started. Now notice all of the family relationships, the occupations, the locations, everything on every document that you have collected, because it's going to help you learn about your family. These are all very important steps that anyone can use. Now, for African Americans, this is where it gets a little dicey. Slavery officially ended in 1865 for everyone. Now, the problem is that 90% of all Black people in America had been enslaved at some point in their lives prior to 1860. The enslaved were not considered people. They were considered chattel property, like a cow or a plow, to be bought and sold at the whim of the enslaver. Now, this is important because for African Americans, prior to the end of slavery, they have to find their records, their family records in other ways. You have to locate the enslaver. That is number two, and this is a huge, huge tip. There are some ways that you can find out who the slave owner was of your ancestors. First of all, try the Freedmen's Bureau records. Those are available for free on FamilySearch.org, and in many other locations you can find these really essential records. What they do is they track what happened to the formerly enslaved people from about 1865 or so until 1872. The Freedmen's Bureau records contain a wealth of information, such as work contracts. So, for those folks who had been enslaved, they might enter into a work contract with their former slave owner. So, that's one way you might be able to find the slave owner. There are also hospital records, bank records, and other records which may also mention the slave owner. Now, why that's important is for African Americans who had been enslaved, the only way, in general, that you're going to be able to find their names is to look at slave owner records. So you have to look at the owner's wills, probate records, inventories, land deeds, bills of sale, marriage gifts, because their enslaved people, well, they weren't people. Their enslaved were given as gifts. They were mortgaged. So that's where you might be able to find the names of your family members. There are also, there's an 1850 and 1860 slave schedule at the census, but that doesn't give the names of your family, but it may be a little bit of a clue. These are some things that African Americans have to do in addition to the normal genealogical research that others have to do. Now, for many, they don't even know who their father was. So, like adopted people, DNA testing may be one of your only recourses to get to the way back records. Did you know that 20 to 25% of the DNA of African Americans in America is Caucasian? It's not just African, and that's because of racial mixing during the slave period. So DNA testing some of your family members, especially the eldest elders, for they are the closest to the old ones that we're trying to find information about, you may find that you are related to Caucasians and other ethnicities, and those people may have records that include your family names. So DNA testing is a great adjunct to normal genealogical research, but you must beware that secrets may pop out. Remember that our people had to do things in the past that we didn't necessarily want to do. We had no control over our lives. So there may be many secrets that DNA are going to uncover. But again, it may help you if you find that you are related to some Caucasians. They have a lot easier time in finding their ancestral records, and you might be able to communicate with them and find out more about your family, especially those documents like wills, probate records, land deeds, bills of sale, that while they are online, some of your people some of those Caucasians may have secret or family letters and family files that they might share with you. The third hint is to seek help from experts. There are tons of social media sites like Facebook and Instagram and podcasts that are all about genealogy. Genealogy for anyone or specifically for African Americans. You can also look at FamilySearch.org. They have a wiki tool that will help you find African American records. The Sons and Daughters of the U.S. Middle Passage is a lineage society, and you must prove that you descend from enslaved ancestors. So check them out too. The Greater Sacramento African American Genealogy Society has an annual genealogy conference in March. So check them out at aafhs.com. And of course, Google, that's your biggest friend. Google African American Genealogy, and that'll point you to many of those social media genealogy sites that I mentioned and many, many, many other things dealing with your African ancestry or African American ancestry. My website, KathyLynneMarshall.com, has lots of stories and how-to books on my site as well as on Amazon, easy to find. I have a chapter in all of my books that's called Solving Your Mystery, and it helps you do these actual steps, but in more detail than what we're discussing right here. And it may help you get started with finding your lineage, documenting it, and writing your story. That's the goal. Write your ancestors' stories and make them a part of the American historical record that our children and all children and people would love to learn about. All right, now you've got your marching papers. Let's get started. It is possible to do this. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't find your African American ancestors, because you can, absolutely.